When does political activism cross the line from protest to, well, criminal activity? And how are America's core institutions really handling the cultural fight for their future?
That's exactly the right question to kick this off, because things are heating up significantly. And it's really against this backdrop that we're seeing these major conservative policy blueprints emerge.
Right. So today we're doing a deep dive into those core priorities. Things like shifting federal power, boosting economic freedom, and really tackling these culture wars, especially on campuses and in social policy.
Our goal is to unpack the data, the actual numbers and the thinking behind these proposals. Proposals designed to, well, pretty drastically limit federal spending, push meritocracy hard, and sort of redefine America's social commitments.
It sounds like a call for a major reset.
Well,
And you see the tension playing out right now, don't you?
Oh, absolutely. You look at groups like Turning Point USA, they're reporting huge crowds, massive growth on campuses like University of North Dakota, Texas Christian University. They talk about students fueling the future of conservatism. It definitely has momentum.
But then there's pushback, sometimes really strong pushback from within those institutions.
Exactly. Like that Rutgers professor signing a petition calling the conservative TPUSA chapter there hate speech, basically just for existing. And unfortunately, we're also seeing actual extremism on the far left that spills into criminal acts.
Yeah, you're talking about things like the Columbia Intifada newspaper being handed out on the October 7th anniversary.
That, and even more seriously, that University of Chicago professor charged with violent felonies, aggravated battery, obstruction during anti-IC riots. It's this really charged atmosphere, this deep conflict that's framing these policy reform proposals.
Okay, let's dig into the first big area this blueprint tackles: education. It seems like a primary battleground focused on merit versus, well, ideological mandates.
Yeah, the push is clearly against ideologies like critical race theory, CRT, and diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. The conservative policy argument is about limiting federal control and opposing things like the Equality Act in schools. They argue these mandates actually distract from education itself.
And the data they present on DEI, particularly around achievement gaps, is pretty startling. It seems counterintuitive.
Yeah.
What's the claim about chief diversity officers?
Well, the policy document cites stats suggesting that school districts employing chief diversity officers, CDOs, the people hired specifically for DEI, actually have wider achievement gaps between student groups.
Wait, hang on. You're saying the role designed presumably to close the gap is associated with it getting bigger, according to this data.
That's the claim being made, yes. The sources state that in districts with CDOs, the gap between the average black and white student is about half a grade level larger. So it's 2.4 grade levels behind with a CDO versus 1.9 grade levels behind in districts without one.
So for conservatives framing this policy, that suggests DEI roles are maybe a distraction or potentially even harmful to the stated goal.
That's precisely the argument. And then there's the cost, especially when you look at universities. It's not just like one administrator per campus, is it?
No, not at all. The numbers are pretty eye-opening. The average university in those big Power 5 athletic conferences employs around 45 people just for DEI programs. 45.
Wow, 45. And often that number is actually higher than the total number of history professors at the same university.
Right, so the policy question becomes, what's the university's main focus? Is it academics and research, or is it this growing administrative structure built around ideology?
And that filters down into the curriculum, too. Conservatives are pushing back against ideology in history teaching, arguing for a narrative centered more on freedom and opportunity.
How does the public feel about that? History curricula are always controversial ground.
Well, according to surveys cited in these blueprints, public sentiment seems to lean that way. Around 70% of school board members and 50% of parents apparently don't want teaching materials based on the idea that slavery is the center of our national narrative.
So they feel that framing is too narrow or maybe inaccurate. What's the alternative they prefer?
They want the focus on America's founding principles. The same sources say 70% of parents and 74% of school board members believe students should learn that freedom and prosperity, not slavery, define the nation. It's presented as a return to objective history and more parental control.
Okay, and this idea of meritocracy, MIT's recent move, seems to really capture that value for conservatives, right? Rejecting funding based on non-academic factors.
Absolutely. MIT was very direct. They said they pride themselves on rewarding merit. Remember, they brought back the SAT requirement first, and they've never done legacy admissions.
So their issue with that proposed funding compact was fundamental.
Yes. They stated it was inconsistent with our core belief that scientific funding should be based on scientific merit alone. Basically, injecting non-merit factors into research funding undermines the science itself from their perspective. Merit is seen as non-negotiable, especially with federal dollars.
That brings us neatly to the bigger picture of federal funding and spending. Let's shift to the financial side of this blueprint. Limiting debt, reforming entitlements to promote work, cutting regulations. The debt figures are just huge.
They really are. It's the massive issue the blueprint goes after hard. The federal debt now stands at over $257,000 per household. Just let that sink in for a moment. That's a direct burden on every family, now and in the future.
And the projections, if nothing changes, are genuinely alarming. We're talking about interest payments becoming the biggest line item.
That's the trajectory. If spending continues like this, the net interest alone on the debt will eventually become the single largest federal program. It would actually eclipse the entire defense budget, Social Security, and Medicare combined.
That sounds like it would cripple any government flexibility.
Right.
So how does the blueprint propose tackling this? It mentions welfare reform, looking back at past examples.
Right, specifically the reforms from the 1990s. They're held up as proof that work requirements can really change things. Those reforms are credited with cutting dependence on traditional cash aid, the kind without work requirements, by nearly 80%, a huge shift.
And did that have wider social effects? The sources mentioned family structure.
Yes. They cite data showing poverty among single parents dropped dramatically, from 33% back in 1996 down to 11% by 2020. And interestingly, they claim the long-term decline in married two-parent families basically stopped right after those reforms.
Suggesting a link between work requirements and family stability.
That's the connection they draw. They estimate that without that reform stopping the trend, an additional 9 million kids might be living in single-parent homes today.
And there's this concept of the success sequence they want to reinforce.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Finish high school, get a job, or go to college, and then get married before having children. The statistic used is that 97% of young adults who follow those steps avoid poverty. So the policy idea is to make the safety net encourage that sequence, acting as a trampoline back to work, not a permanent support system.
Okay, besides entitlements, the other big target is regulation. You hear about red tape, but the cost figures cited are massive.
They are truly enormous. The estimate used in these blueprints is that excessive regulation has dragged down average GDP growth by about 0.8% every single year since 1980. That small percentage adds up to trillions in lost economic activity over decades.
And the sheer number of new rules coming out each year.
Yeah, it's overwhelming. Total regulatory costs are often pegged at over $2 trillion a year. That comes from something like 3,500 new regulations imposed annually. It's like a hidden tax on everyone, especially small businesses.
So the proposed fix is pretty radical then. Congressional approval for major rules and making them expire automatically.
That's the core idea. Require Congress to vote on any major new regulation and build in automatic sunset dates so rules don't just live on forever unless they're proven necessary again. It's meant to systematically reduce that $2 trillion burden.
But wait, sunsetting? Potentially thousands of regulations a year? How feasible is that? Wouldn't that cause massive disruption in critical areas like banking or environmental safety?
That's definitely the practical challenge raised. The blueprint suggests careful prioritization, of course, but the underlying principle they're pushing is that regulations should have to constantly justify their existence and cost, rather than just accumulating indefinitely and, slowly strangling the economy. The burden of proof needs to shift.
Okay, moving from the economy to our final segment, health and social policy. This part of the blueprint focuses on patient empowerment, life protections, and pushing back against government mandates, especially in healthcare.
Yeah, and the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, is presented as a prime example of government intervention leading to negative consequences. One key statistic cited is market consolidation, fewer insurers.
Right, you mentioned the number dropped from 395 insurers in the individual market in 2013 down to just 300 by 2023. Fewer options.
Exactly. And fewer options usually means higher prices, which is what they say happened.
What did happen to premiums for people buying their own insurance?
They skyrocketed. Individual market premiums went up by 129% between 2013 and 2019. The average monthly cost jumped from about $244 to $558. That really challenges the affordable part of the act, according to this perspective.
And the blueprint also uses the COVID-19 pandemic response as evidence against centralized control.
Very much so. It points to the lockdowns and mandates as causing catastrophic social and economic damage, and argues that centralized responses stifled debate and ultimately caused more harm than good.
So the conservative takeaway there is more decentralization, more market competition, more individual choice in healthcare.
Precisely. The argument is that government intervention generally drives up costs, limits choices, and can lead to damaging overreach, with the pandemic response being Exhibit A.
Okay, finally, let's look at the social policy aspect, particularly around abortion and funding. The numbers cited here seem intended to highlight a specific concern about priorities.
Yes, they focus heavily on Planned Parenthood's own reporting. Their 2020-2021 annual report showed they performed a record high number of abortions, 383,460 in that 1 year.
But at the same time, the blueprint points out that other health services offered by them decreased.
Significantly, according to the data presented, cancer screenings were reportedly down 74%, and prenatal services dropped by 72% in that same period.
So the argument is that taxpayer money is increasingly funding abortion services at the expense of other types of care.
That's the core argument, yes. And they note that Planned Parenthood received $633.4 million in taxpayer funding that year, funding the policy aims to eliminate entirely.
And on the legislative side, they point out the U.S. position on later-term abortions compared to other countries.
Right. The blueprint highlights that the U.S. is one of only 7 countries globally that permits elective abortion after 20 weeks gestation. They contrast this with polling data suggesting 7 in 10 Americans actually favor limiting abortion to the first trimester at most.
So wrapping this up, we've traced this conservative policy blueprint. It moves from education, focusing on merit, pushing back on ideology, to tackling government debt and regulation, aiming for greater economic freedom, and finally, reshaping health and social policy around individual liberty and life protection.
And these aren't just abstract ideas, whether it's the cost of your health insurance, what's being taught in your kid's school, or that massive $2 trillion estimated annual cost of regulations. These policy debates directly impact your life, your finances, your choices.
Okay, so the blueprint clearly champions merit in education and science and argues strongly for a much smaller government footprint to control debt.
Yeah.
But here's a final thought, maybe a tension within the blueprint itself for you to consider.
These same plans, while demanding deep cuts to federal spending because of that huge $257,000 per household debt, also call for massive new spending in other areas. They acknowledge the need to confront global threats from China and Russia, which means funding things like nuclear modernization, a larger navy, advanced cyber defense. Can that goal of drastically reduced federal spending realistically coexist with the need to maintain what is, frankly, the world's most advanced and expensive military? Where does that money come from?